Not giving up. I can't. Just keep moving.
Negative, Viper Nest. Retract.
You okay?
We're okay.
What happens when the ultimate dream of a solo sailing expedition turns into a stranded nightmare on a hostile survival island? You
Hold
adapt,
together.
or you simply do not come
Hold
home.
together!
This is the story of
Hold
Michele,
together.
an experienced sailor who lost her boat to a freak, fast-moving storm, only to wash ashore on a remote piece of land that held a terrifying secret.
Where am I?
It was not just the brutal lack of food or fresh water that would test the absolute limits of her human endurance. It was the chilling reality that her island sanctuary was crawling with highly venomous snakes, turning basic island survival into a constant, lethal game of minesweeper, where a single misstep meant certain death.
Everything
The
is
story
perfectly
actually begins in a
aligned.
place of pure, unadulterated joy. For years, Michele had meticulously planned her ultimate goal: a solo sailing expedition across vast, open waters. If you have ever spoken to someone who sails, you know the specific kind of freedom they chase. It is just you, the hull of the boat, and the endless horizon. For the first few days, the ocean was incredibly calm. The wind was perfect, catching the sails with that crisp, snapping sound that sailors live for. She felt completely in her element, navigating the deep blue with the quiet confidence of someone who has finally aligned their life with their passion. But anyone who spends enough time on the water knows that nature is brutally, almost maliciously, unpredictable. It happened with terrifying speed.
I'm not letting go!
A freak storm system,
We're gonna make
a
it!
massive atmospheric anomaly, swallowed the
pressure is
horizon before the
bottoming out.
onboard
Power
instruments
down.
could even
The pressure
register
is
the
bottoming
severity
out.
of the
Power
drop in
down.
barometric pressure.
Hold fast.
The sky
I
did
won't
not
let
just
go.
get cloudy. It turned a bruised, violent
The
purple.
storm is relentless.
Within minutes, the calm
Hold
sea
fast.
transformed into a
The
chaotic
rain.
landscape of massive,
Don't let
rolling
go.
swells that battered her small sailboat with the force of freight trains.
fast.
The wind howled, tearing at the rigging, and the
Losing
vessel
ground.
began to take on
Push
water
through it.
much faster than the bilge pumps could possibly expel it. In a frantic, adrenaline-fueled scramble, Michele realized the devastating
Abandon
truth.
ship.
She was
Go.
going to have to abandon her dream just to save her life. With the
Cut the
deck
line.
slipping precariously beneath her boots,
Hold
she
fast.
managed to deploy a tiny claustrophobic life raft. The timing was a matter of seconds. She threw herself into the inflatable sanctuary, just as the dark, churning depths dragged her beloved sailboat down into the abyss. She had managed to send out a fragmented distress signal moments before the electrical systems shorted out. But as she sat shivering in the raft, surrounded by walls of black water, she knew how incredibly small her chances were. Alone in the vast, unforgiving ocean, Michele spent a terrifying night battling the elements. The raft was barely big enough to sit in, constantly pitching and rolling violently with every cresting wave. She was soaked to the bone, freezing, and clinging to the thin rubber handles, praying the material would hold against the relentless assault of the sea. By sheer luck, and the unpredictable mercy of the ocean currents, the storm began to break as dawn approached.
Please let it be real.
And with the morning light came a sight that flooded her exhausted body with a desperate wave of adrenaline. Land. It was a remote, rugged island, completely devoid of any signs of human civilization. Exhausted, severely dehydrated, and covered in deep bruises from the violent night,
Survive.
Michele let the surf carry the raft onto the beach. She dragged herself onto the warm sand and collapsed. For a few fleeting hours, she lay there, feeling the solid earth beneath her, believing that the absolute worst was over. She had survived the sinking. She had survived the night in the raft.
Water.
She was on dry land, but as the sun
Now.
climbed higher, baking the moisture from her clothes, the primal need for hydration forced her to move. She woke up, gathered her bearings,
to face the
and
wild.
ventured past the dense tree line to search for a source of fresh water. That is when the true
Ready when you
horror of
are.
her situation was revealed. As she pushed aside a heavy palm frond, a distinct, dry rustling sound caught her attention. She froze. The underbrush was alive, slithering through the decaying leaves, and coiled around the low-hanging branches were snakes. And not just one or two. The island was heavily infested with them, an isolated ecosystem where these predators had thrived without competition. Many of them were highly venomous, their scales blending perfectly with the mottled shadows of the jungle floor. This terrifying discovery created a relentless,
step, watch every
dual-layered
single step.
survival conflict. Michelle was no longer just fighting the standard battles of being stranded on a survival island, starvation, dehydration, and exposure to the elements.
Viper.
She was suddenly trapped in
to
an
go
environment
higher.
that actively wanted to kill her with every step she took. She was forced to adapt her entire survival strategy entirely around this slithering threat. Normally, the first rule of island survival is to build a ground shelter to protect yourself from the wind and
The ground
rain.
is a
For
death
Michelle,
sentence.
sleeping on the ground
Stay
was a
up.
guaranteed death sentence.
Almost there.
Instead,
Keep pulling.
she had to exhaust her already
Just
depleted
one more
energy,
tight wrap.
reserves engineering
Done.
an elevated sleeping platform in the trees. Using nothing but scavenged branches, vines, and debris washed up on the beach, she spent grueling
Just the
hours
wood.
lashing together a
Keep the
makeshift
eyes moving.
hammock-like structure high above the jungle floor.
Secure the area.
Every time she needed to gather firewood, it was an exercise in pure terror. She learned to use long, sturdy sticks to aggressively tap the brush
Help?
and sweep the
Over
ground
here?
before taking a single step.
The smoke should carry.
She had to keep a fire burning constantly, hoping the thick smoke would act as a deterrent to keep the immediate area
Show
around her
yourself.
camp clear. She was living in a
Just let
state
me
of
see you.
hypervigilance. You cannot relax when a lethal threat is practically invisible. Her only grounding mechanism, the only thing tethering her to her past life and her sanity,
The faint,
was
gritty
a
friction of
waterproof
a dirty
sailing
fingertip
watch.
sliding over scratched
It was a
steel,
gift from her
paired
husband,
with
David.
a long, heavy sigh
She
of
used it
physical
to track the
exhaustion.
agonizingly slow passage of days, watching the hands sweep in circles, a mechanical reminder that time was still moving, even if she felt completely frozen in a nightmare. Parallel to Michelle's desperate fight for life on the island, a completely different kind of agonizing struggle was unfolding back on the mainland. Her husband, David, had received the terrifying news from the Coast Guard. They had picked up the fragmented distress signal sent moments before the boat sank. A massive search and rescue operation had been launched, but the sheer scale of the storm's path made it the ultimate needle in a haystack scenario. The ocean is incomprehensibly vast, and a tiny life raft is practically invisible from the air, especially in rough seas. As days turned into a full week, the grim reality of maritime rescue protocols began to set in. The authorities, bound by statistics and survival probability models, began to scale back the operation. They gently, but firmly, informed David that they were transitioning the mission from a rescue operation to a recovery operation. They believed Michelle was gone, but David absolutely refused to accept this. Grief is a powerful motivator, but denial fueled by a deep, intuitive love is an unstoppable force. He became obsessed. He completely transformed their comfortable living room into a chaotic war room. The walls and floors were covered in nautical charts, historical weather patterns, and complex
need this.
oceanic drift models.
Just a
He
little
barely
more.
slept, surviving
Don't
on
spill
black
it.
coffee and adrenaline, calculating the exact
adjust the
trajectory of the
parameters for
storm,
windage on a
the
standard
speed of the
raft.
currents, and the windage of a standard life raft.
I need real-time data
He aggressively lobbied military
isolated.
contacts and Coast Guard officials,
possible.
practically
Nothing
begging
is
them to
impossible.
check a specific cluster of remote,
need more time.
uninhabited atolls that the
No,
official
it's
search
here.
grid had missed.
I found it, outside the grid,
He
just like I
argued that if
thought.
she had
Get a team
survived
out
the
to these
initial
coordinates
sinking,
now.
the currents would have dragged her exactly there. It was a long shot, a desperate theory born of a husband's
She is
refusal to
waiting
become a
right
widower.
there.
But he would not let them close the case. Back on the island, the tension was reaching an unbearable peak. Michelle was actually proving to be incredibly resourceful. She had managed to fashion a makeshift spear from a straight branch and a sharp piece of
Finally.
debris, successfully spearing a small fish in the shallows. She had figured out how to catch and store rainwater using broad leaves and the hollowed-out halves of coconuts. She was sustaining herself physically, proving that she had the raw grit required for island survival. But the psychological toll of the venomous snakes was slowly breaking her mind. She suffered a terrifying close call that nearly ended everything. While carefully approaching her small, muddy water source, a large, aggressive snake cornered her near a cluster of rocks. It reared back, hissing, ready to strike. With her heart hammering against her ribs, Michelle was forced to defend herself with her makeshift spear, frantically pulling the creature away from her legs as she scrambled backward in the mud. She survived the encounter, but the adrenaline crash left her sobbing on the beach, clutching her watch, wondering how much longer she could possibly keep this up. Just as she began to somewhat master the rhythms of her hostile environment, nature decided to remind her exactly who was in charge. The sky, which had been a mocking, brilliant blue for days, began to darken once again. The barometric pressure dropped like a stone. A massive tropical depression, carrying torrential rains and howling winds, slammed directly into the island. The storm was absolutely devastating. High winds ripped through the canopy, and torrential sheets of rain battered the landscape.
Hold! Just hold
Shelley's
together!
elevated shelter, the one thing keeping her safe from the deadly jungle floor, was violently torn apart. Branches snapped, vines unraveled, and she was sent crashing down into the muddy, flooded underbrush in the pitch black night. But the destruction of her shelter was only the beginning of the nightmare. The torrential rain caused immediate flash flooding across the island. And here is the terrifying reality of a snake-infested island during a flood. Snakes do not want to come near. The rising water forced the entire population of venomous reptiles out of their subterranean burrows and low-lying nests. They were flushed out into the open, desperately seeking the exact same thing Michelle needed right now. She spent a harrowing, completely sleepless night perched precariously on a slick, wet boulder near the edge of the beach. The water swirled around the base of the rock, carrying debris and displaced, panicked predators. She sat with her knees pulled tightly to her chest, shivering uncontrollably in the freezing rain, clutching the only piece of modern technology she had managed to salvage from the life raft. A single, loaded flare gun. She pointed it into the darkness, jumping at every shadow, every splash, every imagined slither against the stone. It was the longest night of her life, a true dark night of the soul, where the will to live is tested against the seductive ease of simply giving up. As morning finally broke, the storm slowly cleared, leaving the island battered, heavily flooded, and steaming in the rising sun. Michelle was at her absolute breaking point. She was covered in mud, severely shivering from hypothermia, and surrounded by the chaotic debris of the jungle. She slowly climbed down from the boulder, her legs shaking from exhaustion, feeling that she had finally reached the end of her endurance. But miles away, David's relentless, exhausting pressure on the authorities had finally yielded a tiny sliver of hope. A Coast Guard helicopter crew, moved by his desperate, calculated drift models, agreed to make one final, sweeping pass over the outer atolls before officially terminating the search. Shelley was kneeling in the sand, staring blankly at the ocean, when she heard it. It was faint at first, a rhythmic, mechanical thumping sound that felt completely alien in the natural symphony of the island. She turned her head. The thumping grew louder. Rotor blades. She scrambled to her feet, her exhaustion instantly vaporized by a massive spike of adrenaline. She looked down the beach and saw the distant silhouette of the Coast Guard helicopter banking low over the water. It was moving away, scanning the horizon,
Now?
completely missing their small figure against the massive backdrop of the jungle. She had to get to the open, wide stretch of sand at the point of the island. But between her and that open beach was a dense, perilous stretch of flooded bush, heavily populated by the snakes that had been displaced by the storm.
Keep moving!
There was no time to use mechanical steel. The was no time for hypervigilance. She gripped the flag and broke into a desperate, reckless sprint. She tore through the underbrush, her boots splashing in the muddy water, leaping over fallen logs, and praying with every footfall that she wouldn't feel the sharp, fatal sting of fangs. Branches whipped her face, thorns tore at her clothes, but she didn't stop. She tripped over an exposed root, scraping her legs violently against the rough bark. But she scrambled back up without missing a beat. She burst through the final line of palm trees and stumbled out onto the brilliant white sand of the open beach, just as the chopper began to bank sharply away, preparing to head back to the mainland. With trembling hands, she raised the flag to the sky, pulled back the hammer, and squeezed the trigger. A brilliant, screaming streak of red smoke cut violently through the clear morning sky, leaving a thick, unnatural trail behind it. The sharp pop echoed like the roar of the surf in the cockpit of the helicopter. The pilot caught the flash of red in his peripheral vision. He banked the aircraft hard, circling back toward the island. As they approached, the crew looked down and saw her, a tiny, muddy, exhausted figure waving frantically in the sand. The rescue was incredibly tense. The helicopter hovered low over the beach, kicking up a massive sandstorm in a downwash of the rotors. The crew quickly lowered a rescue basket, completely unaware of the slithering, venomous dangers lurking just yards away in the dark tree line. Michelle didn't hesitate. She threw herself into the metal basket, clutching it with the last ounce of strength she possessed. As she was hoisted up into the noisy, vibrating cabin of the aircraft, she collapsed into the strong, waiting arms of the rescue swimmer. They wrapped her in a thermal blanket, shouting words of comfort over the roar of the engine. But Michelle couldn't hear them. She just stared at the floor, her body shaking violently as the adrenaline finally began to recede, replaced by the overwhelming, crashing realization that she was safe. She was going home. The story concludes hours later on a sun-baked tarmac on the mainland. The helicopter touched down, and before the rotors had even fully stopped spinning, David was running across the concrete. The reunion was incredibly emotional. A raw, tear-filled embrace between two people who had refused to give up on each other, even when all the statistics and probabilities told them it was over. David held her as if he would never let her go, whispering her name over and over again. In the final moments, as they walked away from the helicopter, Michelle paused. She looked down at her wrist. The waterproof sailing watch was deeply scratched, covered in dried mud and island dirt, but the second hand was still sweeping in its perfect, uninterrupted circle. She looked up from the watch and cast her gaze out toward the distant, rolling ocean. Her lifelong dream of a solo sailing expedition had been forever altered by the intense trauma of the storm and the terrifying reality of that survival island. The ocean had taken her boat, and the island had nearly taken her life. But as she stood there, leaning heavily against the husband who had moved heaven and earth to find her, that trauma was replaced by something far more profound. She had faced the absolute extremes of nature, fought off unseen predators in the dark, and survived the impossible. She walked away with an unbreakable, profound realization of her own incredible will to live. And if you ever find yourself facing an insurmountable challenge, Remember Michelle's watch. Time keeps moving, and as long as you are still breathing, you keep fighting.